One thing I regularly get asked by photographers is whether or not we can exposure blend a single exposure. And we absolutely can do that. It's something called double processing or triple processing. So if you're making 2 exposures from a single exposure, then that's double processing. If you're making 3 exposures from a single exposure, that's triple processing. And I want to show you an example of that here. So we've got a relatively long exposure shot, and sometimes you can't bracket long exposures because we have our shutter open for quite a long time and we might lose the light over the minutes that we've got the shutter open. Now I did bracket this scene and I did come out with quite a nice balanced image. As you can see here, this is the final shot with a darker exposure and this exposure blended together. But I'm going to pretend that I didn't bracket and that we only have one exposure to work with. Now I'm working with the original RAW file here, the NEF file from a Nikon D800, whereas you're going to be working with the DNG file. So I'm not sure if your results are going to come out exactly the same as mine, but hopefully they'll be clean. So here's our base exposure, and as always we're going to go to our lens corrections and we're going to remove chromatic aberration and enable lens profile corrections. Now you can see that by enabling lens profile corrections, it's removed any potential vignetting from the image. So if you look how bright these edges are now, and if I undo that, you'll see they darken significantly. So I'm going to leave enable profile corrections unchecked just so we've got some shadows to bring back so I can show you how triple processing works. Now I'm going to go back to the main tab here. We don't need to change anything apart from, let's say, the color balance. Now I'm going to bring down the highlights so we can see what the sky looks like and to see whether or not we have a natural looking sky. So I'm going to bring the temperature slider along to make it a little bit colder. And do we need to bring some of the tint along to introduce some greens to the sky? Yeah, I think that looks okay. Now the reason why we double or triple process is because when we bring our sliders along like this, let's say a highlight slider and let's say we bring up the shadow slider, we introduce more image degradation. The more we pull our sliders in one situation, the more degradation we get. And we're limited to how much we can actually bring back our highlights and our shadows at the same time. So I'm going to press default here and we have our base exposure. I'm going to hold down shift as we've done before and open the object. Now I need to duplicate these layers, but I can't right click and choose duplicate layer because that will duplicate this layer, and whenever we open Adobe Camera Raw and make any changes, that will affect both of the layers. Instead, we go to New Smart Object via Copy. And I'm going to call this Dark. Now I'm going to right click on that and do the same thing, New Smart Object via Copy. And I'm going to call that one Bright. Now I'm going to make Bright invisible and I'm just going to choose the dark exposure. I can double click on the thumbnail here to open Adobe Camera Raw, or of course I can open up Instamask if I've got it available and press ACR. Now we want to bring down the highlights. So I'm first going to bring down the exposure and then the highlights. So we're using the dark exposure to recover the overexposed sky. I'm going to bring down the exposure a little bit more, and we're looking here at the brightest parts of the sky. So we're just trying to recover them as much as possible. If that looks okay, we can press OK. And now we go to the bright exposure and we want to recover some of the shadows in these darker areas here and to the left here and to the right. So I'm going to double click on the bright exposure and I'm going to bring up the shadows a tiny bit. Maybe bring up the exposure a tiny bit too. All we're doing is pulling in some information from those darker areas. And then I'm going to press OK. We don't need it to be too extreme. So now to blend these exposures, I'm going to choose the dark exposure. I'm going to go to Instamask. I'm going to create a brights one. Now you know that the base exposure already gives us a pretty decent selection of the sky because it's already quite bright. Now there is going to be some information here in this part of the sky, and in the water, but because we can go over these areas multiple times with luminosity masks, it should be okay. But I don't want to affect the trunk here in the foreground, so I'm going to bring the mid-tone slider along a little bit more and the highlight slider, so we're just making a little bit more of a contrasting selection. So now we've got our sky selected more or less, some of the water selected, but we've excluded much of the mountains and the tree in the foreground. So I'm going to press select, choose a black mask, show the layer, hide the marching ants, and choose a white brush. Make sure my brush is bigger, and now I can paint in the darker exposure. And remember, we can go over this multiple times to strengthen the effect. So we're returning much of that overexposed area from the darker exposure. And if I look at the mask so far, that looks pretty good. And now if I select the mask again, I can paint in the foreground, just reinforcing that selection. And there's the reflection. We've affected the tree a little bit in the foreground, but not too much. And now to bring back some of the darker areas in the tree or in the mountain, we can press deselect to make sure we've deselected any active selection. We can make our darker exposure invisible. So now we've only got our base exposure visible. And we want a selection of the tree down here, the sides of the mountain up here, and this tall mountain to the left. So I'm going to go for a darks 1 first, maybe a darks 2. Now darks 2 is still selecting some of the water along here. So let's go for a darks 3. Right, that's given us a pretty decent selection. We are selecting a little bit of the water, but I think that's pretty good. Why don't we try an RGB mask selection just to see if we can come out with a better selection? So I'm going to go for a darks 3 in the reds channel, a darks 3 in the greens channel, and a darks 3 in the blue channel. And that hasn't given us a better selection. So let's stick with a darks 3 from the RGB channel. And of course, now I'm going to press select, choose a black brush, make the layer visible, hide the marching ants, choose a white brush. And before I said a black brush, I meant a black mask. Close Instamask. And I'm going to choose a lower opacity for the brush because I don't want to brighten these darker areas too much. So I'm going to bring my opacity, let's say to 50% to start off with. And there we go, we're bringing in some of those darker areas. And what about this area in here by the tree? And let's paint in some of the areas along here in the mountain, the reflection, and up the side here. Again, we don't want too much information in these areas. Our shadows are really important for developing mood in our scene. And now when I'm finished, I can open up Instamask and press deselect. So there's the final result after blending in the brighter exposure. We've brought back some nice information there. And when we add the darker exposure, we've got quite a good blend. I think the dark exposure is actually a little bit too dark. The sky shouldn't be as dark as that, so why don't we bring down the opacity of that layer a little bit? And that looks a little bit more natural. So now that we've blended our exposures, we can continue with our workflow as we normally would. Now I just want to do one thing just to show you another way to remove sensor dirt. See, we've got a big blob of dirt right here. And I showed you how to use the clone stamp. That would probably work here as well, but I'm going to show you a different tool. So if we open up the Dodge and Burn panel and just press merge, and we come out with the merged layer. Now this is traditionally a destructive approach. If we click on the patch tool here and we go around the sensor dirt, then we've got a selection. Now if we left click and drag that selection to the right, left, or anywhere really in the image, we'll replace that sensor dirt with this new selection, this new area. But Photoshop does a really good job of trying to make it look natural. So when I let go, press Command and D or Control and D, see we've removed the sensor dirt. Now this is a destructive process because we've created a whole new layer and we don't want to do that. So to make this a non-destructive process, we can create a black mask by holding Alt or Option on a Mac and left clicking on the Add a Mask button so that sensor dirt comes back. We can choose a white brush, make it a lot smaller with a 100% opacity, and we can just paint in that area. So now that layer is only affecting the sensor dirt area, which is exactly what we want. So that's how we can triple process a single raw file. And I'm going to show you a different image where we can double process, combining the technique I showed you in a previous video called pre-masking. And before I do that, I just want to show you this one thing here. This kind of sci-fi futuristic looking thing was part of the set for the Alien, I think it was called Alien Covenant, the latest Alien movie. So it was great when we were close to then. I thought I could get a really cool image, but the security stopped me for obvious reasons. So now instead I just have this white thing on the horizon that I had to clone out. So to the next image. So here we have a photo from Dubai. And again, it's a long exposure and it's actually a pretty balanced scene. You know, I could probably just bring down the highlights a little bit, bring up the shadows, and everything would look great. But I'm not going to do that because I want to show you how double processing isn't just good for recovering overexposed or underexposed areas. Having a separate exposure for one particular area of the image allows us to add unique color to that particular area, or unique contrast, or anything we want really. So it gives us more control over our workflow. Before I get into this, I want to open up lens corrections and we can do the usual enable profile corrections. Then I can perhaps bring the temperature along a little bit just to warm up the scene because it's a little bit cold from my ND filter. And we might be able to bring the tint along, add a few more magentas just to also reinforce how warm that would be. Now we're going to do the same thing in the sense that we're going to duplicate this layer once and we're going to create a darker exposure to bring back the sky. But as you can see, we've already got some information in the sky. So chances are we're not going to be able to make a good mask from that sky. So I'm going to right click and choose New Smart Object via Copy. And I'm going to call this Dark. And I'm going to open up Adobe Camera Raw and I'm going to bring down the highlights. So we get some lovely information in the sky. Once we've done that, I can press OK. And now watch if I try to make a mask on this layer. So I've made the darker exposure invisible, and if I press Brights 1, we're not making a good mask of the sky because it's only partially selected in this mask. You know, we've got lots of the sky which isn't selected. So we can pre-mask the sky in the base exposure. So I can bring up the highlights, bring up the whites, bring down the shadows a touch, and maybe even bring up the exposure. Now it's okay with that. We've got these areas that are still visible because we can change that later. So now we've pre-masked and I can choose my dark exposure, go to Brights 1 and maybe refine this mask a bit more. So you see we're getting more of the sky in there. And I don't want it too contrasting. Then I press Select, Black Mask, Show the Layer, Hide Marching Ants, choose a white paintbrush and a large brush. And then I can paint in the sky from the darker exposure. And I can go over that blending multiple times in areas where it needs to be reinforced, so especially in the corners here. Then I can press Deselect. Now I have to open up our base exposure again, put that to default and bring down the brightness a little bit. Maybe bring up the shadows because they're a tiny bit dark in this image and press OK. So now I mentioned at the beginning of this tutorial that there is a benefit to having the sky, let's say, on one layer and the foreground on the other layer. And we've talked about this before. But let's say if I was working just with a single exposure, it would be really hard to target just the sky to give it more warmth or more dynamism or more contrast. But because we've got this on a darker exposure here, a separate exposure, I can open Adobe Camera Raw again and add some more warmth to that sky. Maybe some pinks as well. So we press OK, and now we've got a much nicer scene. Here's before and after, and we're not affecting the warmth too much of the buildings in the foreground. So it creates a beautiful contrast between that cold foreground and the warmer sky. We can also open Adobe Camera Raw and bring along the clarity slider, which we've done before, to give our clouds more detail. Now naturally, the more we bring that slider along, the more image degradation we'll see, so we don't want to be too strong with that. Maybe just add a little bit more detail. Now I don't think that makes too much of a difference, and I'm concerned by the line that we've gotten here because of that clarity slider. There's some slight edging that you might not be able to see, so I'm going to undo that and zoom out. Alternatively, of course, I can open a curves layer and attach that to the darker exposure, and I can add some contrast to that as well. So you see we're not affecting the foreground. So again, here's before and after, before and after. Now if I zoom into the buildings in the distance, you can see all of the blending is really smooth. It doesn't look unnatural. It doesn't look like it's been chopped together. It looks like it all belongs to the same image. Now let's see about straightening up some of these buildings here because they're a little bit cockeyed, and then we can finish this tutorial. So I'm going to select all of the layers. I'm going to right click and choose link layers. And that way when we change one image, it will affect the rest of the layers that it's linked to. So I'm going to drag my ruler and just bring it across here, let's say. And then I'm going to press Command and T or Control and T on a PC. Right click and choose Distort. And then I'm going to drag this building along to the left, just in the top left-hand corner. And that pulls the image to the left. And now I can do the same with the right-hand side here. So I'm looking down here at this building and seeing how it's jutting out to the left. We've also got a building right at the corner here, which is jutting out quite significantly, so we can lose some of that. Again, I'm pulling that to the left. And that's moved this building to the left a little bit, so I'm going to do that again. And now this line looks quite straight along here, but I'm going to pull this in a little bit more because the central line didn't look straight. And each time we're getting a little bit closer to our desired results. And actually, if I look at the top of that building, that's a little bit further away than this area. So I can actually bring that in, and that's much better. Now we've also squashed the image a little bit. So in this situation, I like to just drag it up just to make sure we haven't squashed the buildings that much. And then when I'm ready, I can press OK. I can press Command and H or Control and H to hide the marching ants. I really don't want to try this. And then I can choose my crop tool, clear whatever my active selection was in the crop tool, and I can drag it down and then up so we haven't lost that other information in the sky. I want to put it to around about here, and that way we're completing the composition by letting this line on the building sit nicely into the corner of the composition. And then I press OK. So now we've got a straightened image with tall, substantial buildings. We've brought back the highlights and given them some beautiful warmth, color, and contrast, all through double or triple processing depending on whatever you're using.